Number 2 on this tape is a 1955 or 54, I'm not sure which, 104 BN1. This car came out of North Carolina, and we're just going to go through it and show you some of the problems that we usually run across. If you sight down the chassis rail from the position we're standing now, you can see that the rail at the very forward part moves off to the left. This chassis was repaired by putting a new section along the bottom rail, and what appears though it may have been grafted at the front. Unfortunately, accuracy wasn't checked at the time it was done, and it's caused the chassis to be on square. If I take the chassis, we can see how much on the two stands, how much this chassis actually moves and is twisted. When we try and do repairs like this, a lot of the time we don't ensure or secure the original chassis properly when doing the patch repairs. The chassis were originally built in a jig assembly, and with all the superstructures on, it's virtually impossible to ensure that you get them straight again. We can see here just a tremendous amount of patching and repairing on this main chassis rail. Okay, if we check the X-member here, one of the problems and one of the things that offers the chassis torsional rigidity is the condition of the X-member. We can see here that the X-member is all decayed and rotted throughout. What happens is that this area here no longer supports or maintains any sort of an accurate dimension for the rest of the car to follow. And here is another common problem with the Austin Healey chassis, both in the 104 and the 3000 models. We can see how the rear gusset members just begin to decay away. The material on these cars is not very thick or heavy, and the longevity of the chassis just isn't there. Sometimes when repairing cars like this, generally we should take a little caution when installing outriggers and other fixtures. You can see here that the rod, the 3/4 rod that we've pushed through the main chassis, will not go into the bracket for the 104 on the outrigger. When repairing an area like this, always run a pipe or a bar through of the size required to make sure that that in fact is in its proper location, and then weld it in position. The type of repair that we see here is not recommended for the reason being that you change too much of the characteristic of the chassis. What happens is you get strong and weak points throughout the main rail, and just beyond those welds it'll start to crack or break. Here again we can see the decay on the X-member by the transmission mount. This here is the rear bumper extension on the 104. Apparently when the repairs were originally done, they failed to take into consideration the location of the bumper brackets and had to notch these out and lower them so it would fit. Another common problem is the shock mounts in the rear. They have a tendency to crack and break out of the chassis. When doing a chassis over, check to make sure that these are in good condition. We can see along this chassis rail that there's just a tremendous amount of welding and heat put into the rail itself. Once that happens, basically the rail becomes very weak instead of stronger, and it comes dimensionally out of its trueness. This is not a good idea or a good way to repair a chassis. We can see here on the front tower, prior to us cutting it off, that this tower was repaired and welded along the back side. One of the problems with doing that is that you have to ensure that the shock is located in the proper position and that the steering geometry goes unchanged when you do a repair like this. A lot of times this isn't taken into consideration. This type of repair is an absolute definite not. This is not a good idea, nor is it a good repair. If we look closer, examining the welds, we can see that they're both cold and have very little penetration into the actual rail. This bracket could break off as easily as prior to the repair. Again, we can see the abundance of weld put into the channel. Volume of weld or consistency of long welds or beads on any panel is not advisable because actually it weakens the structure opposed to making it stronger. One thing that should be noted on this repair was that during all the work effort involved here, there was no attempt made to remove these rear pin shackle bolts. They are obviously seized into the rear carrier. As soon as you were to assemble this and put it back together, the shackle would most likely have worn through this pin and then broken off. Here are some of the parts that we'll be replacing on this 100. You can see we've removed the transmission tunnel, the rear heel board, and the two upper sections that are used for your rear hatch on the 100s. We're also changing the floors and the inner sills and outer sills. All of this was put in new by the owner and just wasn't done properly. We can see here how there were patches put over the original patches on this floor and as well onto this bulkhead corner. On this particular car, we will be changing that whole corner and both front floor pans and the inner kick panel. You can see here on the left side the panel and the repair and patchwork done. Again, on the original bulkhead corner, they have gone to the trouble of welding that whole corner in completely. When doing this, you make the panels weaker, not stronger. If you want to prevent it from leaking, seam seal it. These should be stitch welds or spot welds only. We can see here on the front bulkhead that it's been cut away. I believe the original intention was to do a V8 conversion. The owner of the car has since changed his views on that, and my understanding is that they'll be putting the car back to original again. Here's a shot of the main chassis rail with all the upper structures removed. You can see there's been a tremendous amount of work effort put into this project, only to have it removed and redone. Here is the repaired panel that we have made for this 100. You can see transmission tunnel, the heel panel, and the upper door panel. This is all done out of 18 gauge steel. All the indentations and markings are done here in the shop with our own equipment. We find that a lot of the times the replacement panels offered out of England are done in 2 halves with their 22 gauge steel, which is not really a good way to do this. You can see new trunk boxes being made. We had to repair the rear trunk panel. Again, there was a lot of welding done to this panel. We had to cut all that out, grind it all out, and then repair the panels that were originally put in. You can see here that all we've done is tack them in position. When we lay the superstructure back onto the new chassis, what we'll do is make sure that everything's located in its proper position. Then we'll weld them in properly. Shot of the wheel well area. What they have done is they had grafted 2 wells together, wheel wells together, to repair the old ones. The repair itself is pretty good. Because of the poor quality of the original panels and because of the extensive work required in other areas of the cars, this car, we have chosen to reuse these panels. They're very, very usable and they're in pretty good order. What we'll do is we'll reapply the extra work on the other panels so that it all balances out at the end of this job. Again, this is the left side of the rear superstructure. Again, they had repaired these wheel arches. Once we put this all in and together, it'll be fine. If we examine the rear spring rail spring carrier, we can see that there was a lot of weld again put on it. The problem is that it is a cold weld. A cold weld is a weld that really does not melt the two steels together. It just lays on top of both metals with a very, very low adhesion. These are not good welds. These types of repairs do come apart, and you should really be cautious when having work like this done. Make sure that the person welding knows how to weld. Another problem with the hundreds is this where the battery sits. One of the problems with that is that any acids that come under the batteries will lay on the top of the chassis rail. Eventually these acids will eat away and do damage to the chassis. You can see here on the left side of this rail versus the right side the repair that was done. What we have seemed to have found a lot in the 104 cars, and I haven't seen it as much in the 3000 models, as the spot welds. They seem to be pulling apart more so on the 104s than they did on the 3000s. I don't know if they use more welds or better welding equipment in the later cars. The chassis itself did not undergo any real major changes from the 104 to the 3000. The car we're viewing right now is a 1967 BJ8. The next 2 or 3 cars that we'll be looking at in this section of this film will all be BJ8s at different stages. It would appear as though the consistency of the repairs in these cars are throughout. Each of these automobiles has taken pretty much the same panels in every repair or rebuild. As you can see on this car, we have had to pretty much rebuild the whole rear section. We have new rear inner wheel wells, inner wings, seat pan area, radius arm boxes, trunk floors, and transmission tunnel, as well as the heel panel of the rear bulkhead structure. It's been the practice of a lot of restoration shops to patch these up as best they can and just move the car along. It is our policy preferably to replace the bed where we can and when we can. As you see in the trunk area here, you can see that all this again has been replaced with new panels. The panel that blocks the filler tube, new radius or trunk boxes, as well as the rear lower panel of the rear bulkhead structure. These are all done in-house at our shop. A lot of these panels are not available, and all the sheet steel, the new sheet steel that we do, is all in 18 gauge steel, which extends the life of the panels. We can see here the right side of the BJ8. You can see the inside panel of the rear foot panel that sits at the forward part of the rear bulkhead. All that's new. Now as we look at the radius arm rods, they were of value, I believe, when using the original springs. The springs that we use have a thicker and heavier leaf in them. It doesn't hamper the ride too much. It does stiffen the car up a bit and enhances cornering and maneuvering performance.